12 federal judges have given an interview to NBC News so that, they chose a very fair national news organization, and they decided to air their grievances, so to speak, and say that they don't like what is called the shadow docket of the Supreme Court. That's the emergency docket when the justices are on out of session, when things can still be brought before the court on an emergency basis. And these aren't merits briefs. These aren't big decisions. These are things that are putting on hold lower court rulings. But these 12 judges that decided to go speak anonymously to NBC News are saying, hey, this is dangerous that the Supreme Court is doing what they have full constitutional authority to do because it could put our lives in danger.
And this is what I want to know from these judges is versus the justices. These are lower court judges that oftentimes never get cases even heard by the Supreme Court that they saw. That's one thing. The second part is, and of course the Supreme Court can overturn them. But the third part is what Will said. They're not even overturning or looking at the merits. They're saying, you know what? You made this decision that's going to stop a national program from going into effect. How about we have a case first? Let's get the facts. Why don't you hear the facts first before you issue a preliminary injunction that could stop, like we talked about, those nationwide injunctions, that those are unconstitutional, that those are not correct under the law. And so the lower court judges are basically saying, you took our power away to act like many Supreme Court justices. Sorry, district court judges.
That's how it works.
We respect your work. You do a lot of the groundwork and the trial work, the hard work that goes into the legal profession. But this anonymous group is just wannabe Supreme Court justices.
That was the end game.
It's a bunch of wannabes.
There would be no
That's why they didn't put their name on it. You know why they didn't put their name on it? Because if they did, they'd never be a nominee to the higher court, maybe their district court, maybe their circuit court. They certainly would never make to the Supreme Court. They think they know better than the 9 justices appointed by the President of the United States. That our system doesn't work that way. It doesn't matter what they think. It ultimately matters what the Supreme Court thinks about. Usually, should something be allowed to continue, or does it have to stop while we have the case? That's it.
This interview is from what they say is a dozen federal judges that have voiced their concern to NBC News. They claim that they were appointed by both Democrat and Republican presidents, and they are serving around the country. And they are concerned that the Chief Justice could be doing more to defend the integrity of their work. And as well, they are concerned that these rulings, that because it's the emergency docket, there aren't fully flushed out opinions per se. This isn't giving a ruling on the merits of a case. They're saying because sometimes it's as short as because of the procedural rules here, the stay is granted, and that is giving fuel to the fire of what they're claiming are threats against them and other issues. Jordan, it's kind of shocking to hear federal judges run to the media in such a way like this.
About procedural law. Like, ultimately, the court could agree. They're not taken off the case, by the way, when something like this happens. So as the case continues, and they could ultimately come down with a decision, and it moves on, maybe we're talking about appellate court, and it moves on to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ends up siding with one of these 12 judges that has complained about the Supreme Court issuing procedural rulings without explanation. And again, this is like, should the injunction go into place? Should there be a stay? It has nothing to do with the fact that these judges could ultimately be fully vindicated, probably oftentimes are, by the U.S. Supreme Court. And so what they're mad about is that the Supreme Court would even consider part of their procedural decision-making as incorrect.
Well, and Jordan, that's the other issue. A lot of them are saying, they want more explanation from the Supreme Court, but in some ways that could harm the integrity of the Supreme Court. If they start issuing 30-page opinions about a procedural issue and then go into all this rationale, one, a lot of times, like you said, these aren't necessarily indicating how the final merits will outcome. Right. Then the Supreme Court could find themselves in a bind. During this time when they aren't in session, write something that could then be contradicted later when they get into the merits of the case, could also set up a situation where it lowers the trust or integrity in that final ruling because of a knee-jerk reaction or something that was written in a longer opinion about a procedural motion, that wouldn't be the proper way per se. Now, they have done longer explanations when it's warranted, but for the vast majority of these, that isn't how it should be done.
No, it's not how it should be done. And remember, you flip this around, as Will said, these were judges using procedural law to make merits-like decisions that would stop a program under the Trump administration if it didn't make it to an emergency docket, which most don't, that could effectively stop a program for the entire remainder of the Trump administration because the case might take a few years to get all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. What the court has done has prioritized cases involving executive power disputes between states and the federal government, and between the separation of powers, of course, as well inside the federal government. But what we're seeing is a lot of state versus Trump. And so, of course, those are going to be priority cases because you have to make that decision. First, procedurally, are you going to allow this program to move forward? Do you believe it's more likely than not that this could be found to be constitutional? And you can differ on that. And then you get to the merits and say, were we right when we thought quickly it might be more likely to be constitutional? Now that we've heard all the case, seen all the record, maybe not. Maybe we were wrong. Maybe we did miss something. That's why the arguments and having the cases put out and all the evidence in the lower courts is so important for the Supreme Court to ultimately make these decisions. But this is just because the court and President Trump and really the country have kind of knocked down this idea that you as a district court judge get to make decisions for the entire nation.
Above the President of the United States.
Right, or above the U.S. Supreme Court.
Right.
Here's another angle to this as well. And this is where I kind of want to ding NBC News' journalism on this, because it seems like they just rushed to print what these judges were saying. But they write this paragraph: lower court judges are handed contentious cases involving the Trump administration. They painstakingly research the law to reach their rulings. And when they go against Trump, administration officials and allies criticize the judges in harsh terms. The government appeals to the Supreme Court with its 6-3 majority. And then it goes on to say that one judge said it's inexcusable they don't have our backs about the Supreme Court. Where I think NBC News' journalism needs to be ramped up a little bit is they should have asked every single one of these judges, did you rush to make a statement because you're doing it now, saying that this is putting our lives in danger? Did you rush to make a statement to the media anonymously when Chuck Schumer said this in front of the Supreme Court about Supreme Court justices?
I want to tell you, Gorsuch, I want to tell you, Kavanaugh, you have released the whirlwind and you will pay the price. You won't know what hit you if you go forward with these awful decisions.
Of course, we know what then led after that, which were death threats, people coming up to their homes, people in the streets protesting in front of Supreme Court justices, because all of that was to do was the leaked, right?
Well, that was specifically, I think it was prior to the leak, but it was while the Dobbs case was pending. And the majority leader of the Senate went in front of the Supreme Court of the United States and threatened justices, saying you won't know what hit you. And did we hear, and I don't know, I genuinely don't know, these are anonymous judges, but did they rush to the media to make a statement and say, this is unacceptable, this is a violation of the separation of powers, they are threatening, putting undue pressure on, and instead, what we do see is them rushing to the media here to say the Supreme Court doing what the Supreme Court is constitutionally able to do is threatening our lives. It's nonsensical that they would rush to the media to do this.
Well, this is my favorite part of it. So an anonymous Barack Obama appointed judge said that while the Supreme Court could do more to explain itself, and certainly there's a strong sense in the judiciary among judges ruling on these cases, the court is leaving them out to dry. They're partially right to feel that way. Listen to this. There's a big but here.
I like this one.
But, and this is a Barack Obama appointed judge, the whole Trump derangement syndrome is a real issue. As a result, Judges are mad at what Trump is doing or the manner he's going about things, and they're forgetting to stay in their lane. So surprise, surprise, a judge who actually signed on to this document just admitted that there are too many federal judges who are going outside of their duties because they are obsessed with being opposed to everything that is Donald Trump, because they actually have, as this Barack Obama appointed judge said, a case of Trump derangement syndrome. That's how real it is inside the federal judiciary. We know it was real inside the bureaucracy. Law school, sure, and where do most of these judges come out of? Somewhere between the bureaucracy, government, and law school.
Yeah, I think if you had a lot more judges like that
who admit the truth,
who will admit the truth, then at least could say, hey, I disagree with you on that point of view, but here's the issue we have at hand. Look, I don't think anyone would look at the cases that have been ruled on the last 6 months ago. At least most of these were not done for political reasons.
Yeah, and I would also say this. Most judges do a great service to their country. They're unknown. Their names are not known. And sometimes they do have to take on controversial cases that do make their names known. So any kind of violence is always wrong. But this idea that somehow the Supreme Court, by making decisions on temporary restraining orders, is somehow threatening their lives more than a murder case that they handle or drug cartel cases that they handle. Let's be honest. That's not where you don't see the judges who unfortunately have been targeted. It's by criminals.